The Vanished. July 8th, 1999. Hollow Creek, West Virginia. It was a hot, sticky summer day when Daniel Granger and his two best friends, Nate and Will, set out for a hike in the forest just outside Hollow Creek. They had done it dozens of times before, wandering the familiar trails, tossing jokes back and forth, and daring each other to venture farther into the woods than they probably should. That day seemed no different. The air was thick with humidity, the ground soft under their sneakers, and the sound of cicadas filled the silence between their conversations. None of them could have known it would be the last time they'd see Daniel. Around midday, the boys found themselves at an unfamiliar clearing. A towering oak tree stood at its center, its branches twisted unnaturally, and the underbrush around it was strangely absent. Daniel, ever the daredevil, insisted on exploring deeper, despite Nate's unease. "We should head back," Nate had said, glancing at his watch. But Daniel was already climbing the tree, laughing as he pulled himself up. "I'll be back in 5 minutes," he called down. Those were the last words Nate and Will would hear from him. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At first they thought Daniel was playing a prank, hiding somewhere to scare them. But after 20 minutes, the laughter turned to concern. They called out his name, their voices echoing off the dense trees. But there was no response. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, they were in full panic mode, running through the woods, calling for him, hoping to catch a glimpse of his bright red t-shirt. But it was as if Daniel had vanished into thin air. Hours later, Nate and Will stumbled back into town, breathless and terrified. The local sheriff organized a search party, and for 3 days the town combed the woods in every direction. Dogs were brought in, but they couldn't pick up a scent. Helicopters scanned from above, but there was no trace of him, no footprints, no clothing, nothing. Daniel Granger had disappeared, leaving behind only questions, and a creeping sense of dread that something far worse was lurking in the forest. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. A week had passed since Daniel Granger disappeared, and the town of Hollow Creek was still in shock. His mother, Claire, barely slept. Each night she sat by the phone, hoping for news, her heart breaking more with every passing hour. The house felt emptier than ever, Daniel's room untouched, his bed still made, and his hiking boots neatly tucked in the corner. Claire couldn't stop thinking about that last morning, his carefree smile as he grabbed his backpack and promised he'd be home by sunset. It was late that Friday night when the phone rang. Claire's heart leaped as she grabbed it from the kitchen counter. Maybe the search teams had found something. Anything. "Hello?" she answered, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. For a moment there was nothing but static on the other end. Then, through the crackling noise, she heard it. A faint voice, distorted and low, almost as if it were coming from miles away. "Mom?" The word was barely audible, but Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was Daniel's voice. She was sure of it. "Daniel! Daniel, is that you?" she cried, gripping the phone tighter. The static grew louder, but she could still hear him faintly. "I'm still here," his voice whispered, barely cutting through the interference. Claire's hands began to shake, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. "Where are you? Tell me where you are!" Claire's voice rose in desperation, her eyes frantically scanning the room as if she could somehow pull him through the phone. The line went dead. Claire stood frozen in the kitchen, her mind reeling. She stared at the phone in disbelief, her pulse racing. It had to be Daniel. He was alive, but how? And why had the call been so distorted? She immediately dialed back the number. Daniel's cell phone. It rang once, twice, and then an automated voice. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." Claire fell to her knees, clutching the phone to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She knew it wasn't a dream. She had heard her son's voice. But if Daniel was still out there somewhere, then why couldn't she find him? The morning after the phone call, Claire Granger made a decision. If no one else would help her find Daniel, she would do it herself. Armed with a flashlight, a map, and Daniel's favorite jacket, she set out into the woods. The search parties had stopped combing the area, convinced that any clue would have turned up by now. But Claire refused to give up. She knew something was out there, something that had taken her son. And maybe, just maybe, she could find him. The forest felt different this time, darker and more oppressive. As she ventured deeper, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that sent shivers up her spine. The deeper she walked, the heavier the air felt, almost as if the trees themselves were watching her. After what felt like hours, Claire reached the clearing where Daniel had last been seen. She stopped, heart pounding in her chest as she surveyed the area. The same towering oak stood in the center, its gnarled branches stretching up to the sky like twisted fingers. As she stepped closer, something caught her eye. Strange symbols were carved into the bark of the tree, symbols she hadn't noticed before. They were intricate, circular patterns, with sharp angles and lines that made no sense to her. Claire ran her fingers over the carvings, trying to understand. They felt old, worn by time, yet recent enough to seem deliberate. A chill ran through her as she realized how wrong this place felt. It wasn't just the symbols. The air seemed colder here, the light dimmer, even though it was midday. Suddenly she heard it again, faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Mom." Claire spun around, her breath catching. "Daniel?" Her voice cracked. She stood still, listening, but the forest remained silent. Then she heard it again, more clearly this time, coming from deeper in the woods. "Mom, I'm here." Without thinking, Claire plunged into the trees, her flashlight flickering on as the shadows grew thicker. The voice kept calling her name, luring her further into the woods. But no matter how far she ran, she couldn't see him, only the darkness, and the growing realization that something was very wrong. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened to Daniel wasn't just an ordinary disappearance. The strange symbols in the woods, the eerie phone call, the whispers, it all pointed to something darker, something older than she could comprehend. Desperate for answers, she began searching through the town's records, determined to find anything that could explain what was happening. Hollow Creek had always been a quiet, forgotten place. But as Claire dove into its past, she uncovered something chilling. In the local library's dusty archives, she found a series of old newspaper clippings from the 1950s and 1960s. The headlines sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Local boy disappears in woods. Search abandoned after 2 weeks. Third child missing in mysterious circumstances, and no clues in Hollow Creek vanishings." It wasn't just Daniel. Over the years, other children had gone missing in the same woods, their bodies never found, their cases left unsolved. Claire's heart pounded as she pieced together the pattern. Every 10 to 20 years, a child would vanish without a trace. The town would search, then give up, and life would go on as if nothing had happened. But the disappearances were too frequent to be a coincidence. One name appeared repeatedly in the old articles: Walter Hensley, a recluse who had lived on the outskirts of Hollow Creek during the time of the vanishings. Hensley had been the subject of whispered rumors, accused of strange behavior and odd rituals. After the last disappearance in 1963, he had vanished as well, leaving behind only rumors and fear. Some believed he had fled, but others claimed something far darker, that he had been involved in occult practices, and that his disappearances were no accident. Claire felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She remembered the abandoned cabin she had stumbled upon in the woods, the eerie symbols carved into the trees. Could it have been Hensley's? Could he still have a connection to what was happening now? Determined to find out, Claire gathered the newspaper clippings and left the library, her mind racing. Whatever was out there in the woods, it had been there for decades, and it wasn't finished. The atmosphere in Hollow Creek grew more suffocating with each passing day. Daniel's disappearance had left the town on edge, but when Mia Turner, a bright and bubbly 16-year-old girl, went missing 2 weeks later, the quiet panic turned into full-blown terror. Mia had been camping with her family near the same woods where Daniel had disappeared. They had planned a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. On the second night, Mia had wandered off to gather firewood just before sunset. When she didn't return after an hour, her parents started to worry. By nightfall, they were frantically searching the campsite, calling out her name. Just like Daniel, she had vanished without a trace. News of Mia's disappearance spread quickly through the town. Now, even the most skeptical residents began to fear something far darker than a simple lost child. Whispers of Walter Hensley, the strange symbols, and the cursed woods began to resurface. The sheriff, Tom Harris, who had been dismissive of Claire's fears, could no longer ignore the unsettling pattern. 2 teenagers missing in the same woods, in less than a month. Something was horribly wrong. Claire, desperate for answers, approached Sheriff Harris once again. This time she was armed with the old newspaper clippings and her theory about Hensley and the occult rituals that seemed tied to the disappearances. Reluctantly, the sheriff agreed to listen. "I can't pretend this isn't connected anymore," Harris admitted, his face drawn and pale. "But if it's true, what are we dealing with? Something supernatural?" He scoffed at the idea, but couldn't deny the growing unease gnawing at him. Together, Claire and Harris began looking for more connections between the missing children. They combed through old police reports, trying to piece together any overlooked clues. It became clear that the disappearances weren't random. Each one seemed to occur in the same area of the forest, always at dusk. As they worked, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whatever had taken Daniel and Mia was still out there, and if they didn't act soon, she feared more children would disappear into those dark woods, never to be seen again. The nightmares began soon after Mia's disappearance. Every night Claire would wake in a cold sweat, her son's voice ringing in her ears. "Mom, I'm here," he would whisper, his voice distant, pleading. It always felt so real. Claire would bolt upright, heart racing, half expecting to see Daniel standing in the doorway. But he never was. The dreams were relentless, dragging her deeper into exhaustion. Each night the voice grew louder, more urgent, as though Daniel was trapped somewhere just out of reach. One night, the voice wasn't in her dreams. Claire awoke to the sound of rustling outside her window. She sat up, heart pounding, and listened closely. The wind whispered through the trees, but there was something else, something unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she heard it again. "Mom!" The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was Daniel, and it was coming from the woods behind the house. Without thinking, Claire grabbed her flashlight and ran outside, her bare feet crunching against the dew-covered grass. The moonlight barely illuminated the path as she ventured into the trees, her flashlight flickering on. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice shaking. "Where are you?" The only response was the soft rustling of leaves and that same haunting whisper. "Mom, I'm here." She followed the sound deeper into the woods, her breath catching in her throat as the darkness thickened around her. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching down to pull her in. The further she went, the colder the air became, as if the forest itself was swallowing her whole. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. Claire froze, her heart thudding in her chest. She stood in complete darkness, the oppressive silence pressing in on all sides. And then she heard it. Not Daniel's voice this time, but something else. Faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was circling her. "Who's there?" Claire whispered, fear creeping into her voice. The footsteps stopped. She strained her ears, listening, her body trembling. Then, from just beyond her line of sight, she saw a shadow. Tall, thin, and unnaturally still. It stood watching her, silent and menacing, before slowly retreating into the darkness. Claire turned and ran, her mind racing. Whatever was in those woods wasn't her son, but it wanted her to believe he was. Shaken by her encounter in the woods, Claire couldn't ignore the growing sense that something far more sinister was at play. Desperate for answers, she returned to the abandoned cabin she had found days earlier. Armed with Sheriff Harris and a sense of determination, they forced open the rotting door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and dust hung in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. The cabin was small, its walls covered in yellowed, crumbling wallpaper, but what immediately caught their attention was the large, weathered table in the center. Strange symbols, similar to the ones Claire had seen carved into the trees, were etched deeply into the wood. Old, melted candles and scattered bones littered the floor. But it was what they found hidden under a pile of old blankets in the corner that sent chills down their spines. A tattered, handwritten journal. The journal belonged to Walter Hensley. Its pages were filled with disturbing accounts of dark rituals, chants, and sacrifices. The more Claire read, the clearer it became. Hensley had been performing rituals to summon an entity from another realm, something ancient and malevolent. According to the journal, the entity demanded offerings, children, to sustain itself, drawing them into a liminal space, a place between the living and the dead. Claire's stomach twisted as she realized the horrifying truth. The disappearances weren't random. Hensley had been trying to summon this entity, and it had never left. The symbols were part of a ritual to keep it tethered to the woods, and the children, Daniel, Mia, and the others, were sacrifices to feed its insatiable hunger. But the worst revelation came when she flipped to the last page. The final piece is the blood of the mother. She staggered back, the journal slipping from her fingers. "It's been after me all along," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "It needs me to finish the ritual." Sheriff Harris paled as the weight of the realization hit him. If that's true, then Daniel and Mia are still alive, trapped somewhere between this world and whatever that thing is. Claire's breath caught. Then there's still time. I can stop this. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. The entity wanted her blood, and it wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The forest was eerily silent as Claire and Sheriff Harris made their way toward the heart of the woods. It was dusk, the same time when Daniel and Mia had vanished. Claire's hands trembled as she clutched the journal and a small hunting knife, the only weapon they could find. Harris was beside her, his face pale but resolute. They both knew the danger, but there was no turning back now. If they didn't act tonight, Daniel and Mia would be lost forever. The ritual site lay deep in the forest, far beyond where the search parties had gone. As they approached, the temperature dropped sharply, and the light seemed to bend, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally through the trees. They found the clearing marked by a circle of stones, and at its center, the towering oak loomed, its branches stretching toward the sky like blackened claws. Claire swallowed her fear. She could feel it now, the presence of something watching them, waiting. The ritual had been incomplete for decades, but now, with Claire here, the final piece was falling into place. The entity wanted her blood to finish what Hensley had started, and it would stop at nothing to get it. Suddenly, the air shifted. From the shadows, figures began to materialize, vague, distorted shapes that moved in and out of focus. Claire's breath caught. Among them, she saw Daniel, his face pale, eyes hollow, and Mia beside him, reaching out as if calling for help. But something was wrong. They weren't fully there, as if caught between worlds, fading in and out of existence. Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Daniel! Mia!" A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the trees, and the entity began to take form. It was tall and twisted, its face a void, its body shifting with dark, smoky tendrils. It whispered her name, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, echoing in her head. She knew what it wanted. Harris grabbed her arm. "We need to go, now!" But Claire shook her head. "No, I know what I have to do." With shaking hands, she knelt at the base of the oak and pressed the blade against her palm, wincing as blood began to trickle down. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the entity let out a terrifying, inhuman scream. For a moment, everything went black. When Claire opened her eyes, the forest was quiet. The figures were gone, the entity vanished. And standing before her, Daniel and Mia, whole and real, their eyes wide with disbelief. She had broken the ritual. But as she stood there, bleeding and weak, Claire couldn't help but feel a lingering presence. The forest still held its secrets. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, the entity waited, patient and hungry. Evil never truly dies. It had been 25 years since the disappearances, and Hollow Creek had tried to forget. The once vibrant town had faded further into obscurity, its population dwindling as people moved away, haunted by the eerie history no one wanted to acknowledge. The old tales were whispered only by the town's oldest residents, warnings that were dismissed by the few who remained. The woods, now overgrown and dense, were avoided by all except those too young to remember what had happened there. The Anderson family had recently moved to Hollow Creek, looking for a fresh start. They didn't know the town's history, and no one bothered to tell them. To them it was just a quiet, remote place where they could escape the chaos of city life. Their children, Ethan and Sarah, took to exploring the town's edges, their curious minds fascinated by the untouched wilderness that surrounded their new home. One afternoon, the children wandered deeper into the woods than they ever had before. It was autumn, the air crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot as they played. Ethan, who was always the more adventurous of the two, led the way, darting between the trees and laughing as Sarah tried to keep up. But then, something caught his eye. A strange marking on a tree, almost hidden beneath layers of moss. A symbol, worn but familiar to the woods. "Look at this," Ethan said, pointing it out to Sarah. She frowned, running her fingers over the strange design. "What do you think it means?" Before they could wonder further, they noticed something half buried in the leaves. It was an old, weathered journal, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. Sarah picked it up carefully, wiping away the dirt to reveal faded handwriting scrawled across the front page. They sat on a fallen log, thumbing through the pages. Strange drawings, symbols, and disturbing descriptions filled the journal, though much of it was too faded to read clearly. But the final entry was still visible. "The entity slumbers, but it is never gone. It will wait, as it always has, for another to find it. The cycle will begin again." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as the wind seemed to shift around them. The woods grew quieter, darker, as if listening. "Come on, let's go," Ethan said, standing up. Sarah hesitated, her eyes lingering on the journal. Something about this place felt wrong, but she couldn't explain why. As they walked back toward the house, the woods remained still. Watching, waiting. The entity was patient, and it knew the time would come again. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos.